everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Kevin Lyman. I am the CEO and former chief scientist at ENLITIC. We're a startup based out of San Francisco developing clinical applications of artificial intelligence aimed at sitting alongside clinicians, primarily radiologists, to assist them in providing faster, earlier, and more accurate diagnostics. We're about 5 years old, and in that time have amassed a number of accolades for our work in the space, most notably being named to MIT Technology Review's 50 Smartest Companies 2 years in a row, and more recently having won the first Cube Global Tech Fair, where Steve Wozniak, the technical co-founder of Apple, gave us the €1 million grand prize, as well as this wonderful quote, "In my opinion, ENLITIC is what technology should be about. We should trust our machines to be smart." This is a good example of the type of ethos we try to live by, that ultimately it doesn't really matter how accurate our algorithms are. What really matters is, are people using our algorithms outperforming those who do not? Ultimately, trust is an incredibly important factor in healthcare, and we need systems that can sit appropriately alongside clinicians. We've been fortunate to be covered by just about every media outlet, both in the US and abroad, CNN, NBC, BBC, etc. We have a different documentary or film crew in the office with us about once every quarter on average. To give a little bit of background on the team, we're about 35 full-time engineers, data scientists, clinicians, and medical device experts, with about 65 part-time radiologists around the world, each of whom have been individually qualified in the area that they guide the development of our algorithms. To give a little bit of background on the leadership team, I'm the CEO now, but was not originally when I joined. I was originally a forward-deployed engineer, meaning that it was my job to sit on site with clinicians, understand their workflow, and build them solutions on the fly. I eventually took that back to the modeling team, eventually taking it over as the chief scientist, and about 18 months ago was promoted to the CEO role. And so it's been quite an exciting ride to see the nuts and bolts of the business from just about every angle, now marrying that in a unified vision. Prior to joining ENLITIC, I'd founded two similar businesses, one developing wearable biometric sensors for clinical trials, the other developing natural language algorithms for resume analytics for the recruiting industry. I got my start in machine learning at SpaceX, developing the first simulation models for the self-landing rocket, and before that started my career as a pro gamer. I also like to highlight our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Anthony Upton, who I think is really the ideal picture of what a CMO of a company like this should look like, in that Anthony is not an academic studying radiology, but rather a practitioner in the field every day fighting the challenges that he needs AI to help him with. Anthony built the busiest private clinic in Australia, taking it from under $1 million to over $13 million in annually recurring revenue, while personally reading more than 250,000 X-rays, CTs, ultrasounds, and MRIs in that time, nearly twice the national average, and with the highest accuracy we've seen of any clinician anywhere. To give a bit of background on our funding history, we've raised just over $50 million US to date, primarily coming from leading US Silicon Valley VCs, as well as healthcare organizations around the world with whom we strategically partner. Our two largest investors are Capital Health, the second largest provider of diagnostic imaging services in Australia, and Marubeni Corporation, one of the largest healthcare sales organizations in Japan. Now, both companies really represent the types of partners we work with, in that they had been working closely with ENLITIC for at least a year each prior to choosing to lead some of our funding rounds. I'm happy to say that about 2 hours ago, I had the opportunity to announce live on Bloomberg that we've just closed an additional $25 million in funding, coming largely from each of our major investors coming back in to further support the company. Thank you. I appreciate that. To give a little bit of background on what we do, it's a little bit different from most medical AI companies in that we try to develop everything end-to-end, meaning that we don't just get handed a data set and see what we can build with it. We start by sitting with customers to understand what their clinical and economic needs are. We then go out and find all the data necessary to build such an application with AI. Then we go out and we train teams of clinicians on how to label medical data in order to produce those applications. We then go the stage of rigorously validating these applications and then seamlessly integrating them alongside whatever software it needs to coexist with. We try to build our solutions in such a way that we can simultaneously serve healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance providers, in turn benefiting from the unique data that gives us access to. The primary system that we build is something we'll be deploying commercially in the United States early next year. It is a computer that sits at a radiology provider or hospital system, allowing us to process data on-site on the fly. We update it month to month with new algorithms that help clinicians with new types of diagnostic tasks, currently primarily within the space of imaging. Radiologists using our software primarily see four main benefits, the first being improved efficiency. if we're ultimately pointing everything out for them, measuring, and in many cases even generating a clinical report for them to simply correct, all of these things save a tremendous amount of time. The second being higher true positive rates. Ultimately, it's much harder to miss the subtle lung nodule hiding behind the cardiac shadow if we put a big gratuitous circle over it with AI. The third being lower false positive rates, that ultimately you are much less likely to biopsy that nodule if we can give you 12 reasons it's actually benign. And lastly, what we call emergent insights, which are essentially predictive analytics that would be impossible to see without AI pointing it out for you. Our main example there is early detection of malignancy. We can often pick up malignant lung cancer up to 2 years earlier than human clinicians can. The first ever clinical application that we built and deployed is a really convenient example to understand closer what we do. Our first application was wrist fracture detection. Now, I had the good fortune of getting to run the clinical trial on this application about 4 years ago, making it probably the first clinically deployed application of AI in radiology. The way this system works, anytime a radiologist brought up an X-ray of the wrist in whatever software they already happen to be using, automatically there were blue circles sitting over any of the fractures or regions of interest. We ran a trial where we had 6 radiologists reading each of 400 X-rays, once with our help, once without our help, and with 2 months of washout period to forget what they saw the first time. Typical double-blinded clinical trial setup. What we found in the process was that radiologists with our support were reading cases 21% faster. They caught 11% more of the true positive fractures while making 9% fewer mistakes. All of these are substantial numbers in any area of medicine, but ultimately it was more eye-opening in that we realized we did a great job at solving a very small problem. Very little of their time is spent on wrist X-rays. So at that point, we began to invest in infrastructure and expertise to scale this process across the full body, across all of X-ray, CT, and MRI. Ultimately, at that point, it becomes something useful for a radiologist to work with. I'm happy to say that at the rate that we're developing now, we're on track to be able to cover about 95% of common X-rays by the end of this year. To give another example, a slightly more complicated one, this is a screenshot of our work in lung cancer screening. If anybody wants to grab me afterwards, more than happy to let you play with a live demo of it. But here we enable software to point out every suspicious lung nodule in chest CTs for a radiologist, ultimately scrolling them through the scan for them, while additionally measuring, characterizing, and even tracing through time each of those findings. We even go so far as to generate the report for them to simply make a correction if they need to. You can imagine that all of these things speed up tremendously the process of reading a CT scan. In the latest trial we ran around this, we had a team of 4 expert clinicians working together to interpret scans from a panel of 1,000 patients, each of whom had chest CTs. We blinded the radiologists to this, but we had biopsied each of those patients to know ground truth of whether they were benign or malignant. What we found was that the panel of 4 caught 93% of the malignancies, but with a 2/3 false positive rate. Believe it or not, that's actually pretty average with what we've seen around the world. Our algorithm, on the other hand, caught 100% of the malignancies and with half the false positive rate, really highlighting the kind of costs this can reduce in large-scale screening systems. More interestingly, we found that we often pick up those malignancies 18 to 24 months earlier by using algorithms to recognize the early signs of malignancy. I'm happy to say that a few weeks ago, we actually got our first allowance from the FDA for most of the functionality that backs this application as well. One of the first major commercial applications we're pursuing on a global basis is chest X-ray interpretation. Chest X-rays make up about 50% of all radiology studies worldwide, but despite their ubiquity, are incredibly challenging to interpret. This is because it's a very non-specific modality that's very good for screening, but not very good for diagnosis. For this reason, we've trained algorithms to simultaneously identify 45 different patterns of abnormality in a chest X-ray, which we're able to map to a fully sweeping differential diagnosis. I am also happy to show a demo of this for anybody that wants to catch me afterwards, but you can see that we process scans in about 15 milliseconds per GPU, which is about 10,000 times faster than human interpretation. We are currently scaling this into other areas of application as well, including moving into cardiology, pathology, oncology, and genomics, ultimately leveraging the scalable infrastructure we've built to build these applications in radiology. We're also starting to move a little bit further upstream in radiology, building algorithms for image acquisition and reconstruction. If any of you have ever gotten an MRI before, it can take up to an hour. Ultimately, we can use the same technology that we use in diagnostics in order to capture that same scan in 5 minutes instead of 55 minutes. ultimately that'll lead to a tremendous boom in the number of more advanced images that can realistically be provided. Ultimately, we also, as I mentioned earlier, work with pharma and insurance companies primarily in patient recruitment, clinical trial optimization, and areas around risk stratification. In building these applications, we've built a sophisticated IP portfolio with about 37 patents granted or pending, each of which cover cornerstone applications in AI. And we also publish quite actively, on average about a paper every other month. Our most recent 2 technical papers will both be presented at NeurIPS, the most prestigious machine learning conference, in about 3 weeks. And our most recent clinical paper was published in the Journal of American College of Radiology back in May. So thank you all for your time, and feel free to catch me afterwards if you want a demo or want to discuss further.